Two writers, one just starting out, the other a bestseller. Join James Blatch and Mark Dawson and their amazing guests as they discuss how you can make a living telling stories. There's never been a better time to be a writer.
Hello and welcome to the Self-Publishing Formula podcast. We are live back in New York City. I don't know why I say live. We're here. We're real people actually in New York City. The home, I guess, Mark, world famous home of traditional publishing.
One of the homes. London or New York. You could certainly say it would be one of those two.
But in the States, people talk about New York as an adjective. Then I went to New York and got published.
They do, but in London, in the UK, they probably say went to London. So it depends where you are. But yes.
I went to Bloomsbury. Which actually is a company as well.
Yes.
That's confusing. Okay, but anyway, traditionally synonymous with traditional publishing here in New York, but things are changing, and they've changed rapidly, even in the time we've been doing this podcast, and I think that was evident nowhere more than at ThrillerFest this week, and will probably be the same for you at RWA in Denver next week. And we heard from John Land in episode 1 of this little series from New York that a few years ago they were wondering whether they should allow indies in at all, or they have a separate category for them and so on. And there's a few legacy things. We noticed an award last night for first ebook, which I was a bit confused about, because I think virtually every book that gets published is an ebook as well as a paperback, and what qualifies one or the other. But anyway, I think those things will increasingly go, as John Land himself said to us, this is a blurred line area now.
Yeah, that was a bit of an anachronism, I think, which will probably shake out as we go. And it's, again, I say this enough. I said it a lot this week, that my view is that it's not really about how you get your books, your stories, whether it's dead trees or bursts of electrons. It doesn't really make any difference. It's all about the story. So I think it won't be that long before we have just best story. That would make more sense to me. But anyway, it's still shaking out. There's a long way to go yet.
Okay, well, we have a lot of interviews to get through in this episode. It's going to be a good one, so you and I are going to talk to a minimum. We're going to start with Lexi Blake. Now, Lexi is a romance writer. She writes romance suspense. She's a prolific writer. She's both indie and trad. Fantastic person to talk to. She's doing a lot right and doing extremely well. So let's first of all hear from Lexi Blake. Lexi, we just listened to you on a panel and said we've got to have a chat with you because you talk such strong, sensible language about indie publishing in particular. So first of all, give us the SP on who you are.
I'm Lexi Blake. I write romantic suspense and some urban fantasy. I started publishing about, it was 2010. I like to say I've published in every possible way you can publish a book. With the exception of I haven't done vanity. I've done it myself where I've got like a hardback in my car, but any other way I've done it. Ebook, small press, traditional, so I've kind of learned the business.
Inside out. Well, yes. Stephen King started off by selling books out of the boot of his car, so...
Yeah, I know John Grisham did. Yeah.
So, you sat on a panel just now where you discussed indie and trad alongside each other, and there was, as usual, not a massive consensus. I'm not really sure quite what to take away from it, but one of the interesting areas is where we're going to be in the future on this in traditional publishing. Do you see traditional publishing as being cleverly adapting at the moment, or the Titanic ignoring the iceberg?
Is my traditional publisher watching?
They'll appreciate the
I actually don't think that they're adapting particularly well. I think what's going to happen in the future is what we're going to see is traditional publishers handle both very, very people starting out and really big people. And I think that what we'll see are those mid-listers who come out of traditional publishing when they learn the business to start making money indie-wise. Because I think I talked a little bit about the fact that traditional and indie publishing, it ends up being the same. The same people, you in some ways you've got almost the same kind of shot at the big money, the big sales. You can do it either way, but it ends up being the same. The same 10% of people are going to make a living off of it, and it's harder for the rest. But I do think it's easier to be an indie mid-list author, to make that kind of middle ground money that you can live on, and you can be a working author. I think that's actually easier to make it an indie. Now, to make the big money, where you've got your own private jet, you practically have to be traditional.
Okay. Well, let's move on to the private jet in a minute, but let's talk about your writing. So you are a prolific writer. Did you say you started in 2010?
Well, I started writing when I was a kid. I wrote 10 or 11 books before I actually published. A couple of them will never be seen, but I also got really serious about it late in life, so I say I've got to make up time. But yeah, I've written and published about 60 books since 2010.
I think we counted 61 when we looked.
Yeah.
And
I don't write short books.
Right. But then romance readers are famously voracious in their appetite for books.
They are.
And that's also a very important thing for people to understand about being able to turn a profit in indie publishing in particular. You need product, right? Yes.
It's much more of a grind. But for me, I actually like it. I don't know what I'd do if I was just writing a book a year. I like the challenge of keeping going, but you have to be very disciplined to do that.
Yeah, so you are obviously very disciplined. How and where do you write?
I write. I've got an office in my house. My husband is home at this point in my career. My husband's home, so he takes care of a lot of that. And I write 3,000 words every day.
Okay, you have a 3,000 word count.
3,000 words every single day, and until I get closer to the end, and then I kind of power through.
And your books must be overlapping, and so you must be like editing one and writing the next.
I do. I tend to. I write in the morning, and I edit in the afternoon.
Okay. And what about your marketing?
I'm sorry.
About
marketing. I am a terrible marketer. I like to handle the organic marketing myself. Dealing with fans. I do a lot of stuff where I'll get on Facebook Live and interact and do stuff like that, answer questions. The traditional marketing, I actually do have. I have groups. I've got a social media manager who makes my ads and kind of follows them, and she knows. So I kind of do it that way.
So just to clarify, you're hybrid?
Yes.
So what's the percentage split in your 61 books?
I've got 8 books with Berkeley, so I'm heavily invested in the indie. But
so primarily indie, but
yes,
okay,
yes.
So that's amazing because you do well, right?
I do. I've had I think I've had 9 books on the Times.
Okay, fantastic, and you're making a good living.
Yes.
Good. So I just wanted to establish that because you say I'm terrible at marketing, but I mean, what, do your books simply look after themselves, or?
I think what I am good at is I'm good at using. I'm good at making people buy the next book.
Okay. Loyal readers.
Yeah, I think if I can get you hooked with the first book, and I do some things to get people hooked with the first book. I write very serial books. They're complete. But I come from comic books, so I like to start the next book at the end of the first book and give you a tease of the next one and then have that click right there for you to buy the next one.
Okay, so not quite a cliffhanger, which is can be a cynical commercial ploy.
Not a cliffhanger.
But
a preview of what comes next.
Yeah, well, Marvel do that, right, at the end of their films. So it seems to work for them.
Absolutely.
And in terms of organising the covers and the blurb and all that stuff that you do when you're an indie publisher, when do you do that? How do you do that?
I actually have my own. I work with a photographer to shoot my covers. So we kind of initially sit down and come up with like the concept of what we want to do. Then she's out in LA and she casts for it, and then we've got a really, really great cover artist who kind of comes up. We really want the books to look slick. We don't want it to look any different from a New York publisher. So we're willing to put the money and time into building that brand for a series.
Yeah, I mean, that's going some, because most people, vast majority, even in traditional, will use stock photography. But for you, it's important to have that.
It is
originality.
I've seen a lot, and I've had some covers. Not all of them are done. I've basically done my new stuff like that. But I've got some stock too. It's always kind of weird though to see your book cover on another when you get that.
Yeah, and there are always one or two very popular stock photographs you start to see around.
And what I like too is when we shoot, we can then build the marketing campaign, build the ad campaigns off that photo shoot. So we're using the same models, and it's all branded, and it all looks when you see it.
And you own the photographs. You've commissioned them, and
yes.
so that's a really good advantage. So what advertising are you doing?
I do a lot of Facebook ads. I am just now learning about AMS ads in Amazon ads. I don't do a ton of it though. I primarily sell off of word of mouth.
You have a mailing list?
I do.
So how big's your mailing list?
It's not big. It's 15,000.
Okay.
But I've got a 40% open rate, so that's good.
It's a strong 15,000.
Yeah. I actually culled my list down, which I was told I was not supposed to do. But when the European GDPR came in.
We love GDPR. That was our favourite moment of recent years, wasn't it? I want to do that all again. Yeah, so we all did that.
But I also do, I love, what I found is if you can get people to follow you on Amazon or follow you on BookBub, that's a very, very helpful thing to do.
Yeah. So you use BookBub, do you use paid BookBub ads or featured deals?
I do. I will do the paid BookBub, like the pre-order, because BookBub will actually send out, if you qualify, they'll send out a newsletter for everyone who follows you on BookBub. And that my BookBub list is actually bigger than my mailing list. They'll send out this came out today for you. But I do a pre-order one too that I pay for.
Okay, yeah. And you find that works
It's very helpful.
Yeah. Again, BookBub's the place where the readers with voracious appetites hang out.
Yes.
Because they want the volume of books, and you're obviously supplying that. Okay, so your writing style obviously is important to you in terms of being able to take somebody on one after the other. But what do you do to nurture the audience beyond knowing that you hope they'll want to read the next book? I mean, do you have a relationship with your readers?
I do. I actually have a readers group that's very, very active. This particular one is on Facebook. What I really like about it is it started out, they just talked about my books, but it's kind of grown into a little community. And now I don't even have to answer half the time because somebody will come in and say, oh no, that's coming out this time. But I think having that open kind of dialogue where people can come and ask you questions, like what was your thought process on this? And we have a thing called the spoiler zone that I post, and I'm like, discuss your conspiracy theories about what's happening in the next book. And I really love watching them, just kind of, where is she going with this?
And do you ever read something someone's written and thought, God, that's better than the idea I had?
I often find that they guess really, really well. I think I've been so clever. But so I'm often looking at that going, but that doesn't happen until book 5.
Yeah.
Oh.
And so on that subject, do you plot?
I kind of plot the big things. I like to know where I'm going. Like, I like to have like the touchstone points, the beginning, something in the middle, and something at the end. But then I kind of like to let it flow because I usually find something out in the middle of the book, and that's kind of what makes it exciting for me. But I'm a very linear writer. I'm going to write from the beginning to the end. I'm not going to skip stuff.
Yeah. And you're telling me you must be doing more than a book a month, are you?
Oh gosh, no.
No.
No, I typically write a book about every 8 weeks.
Okay.
Every 8 weeks or so. What you got to remember is, and I'm coming out hard and fast right now because I bought back a bunch of books that I wrote in the early 2010, from 2010 to 2014, from my small press publisher, and I'm actually re-editing, putting them in my new world, and putting them back out. So that's why I have a book, I think, every 2 weeks for a little while.
Wow,
yeah.
Which is going some. How many series do you have within your 61 books?
Oh my gosh, I think I have 6 series. I have a series called Texas Sirens, a series called Nights in Bliss. My big series is Masters and Mercenaries. I have a series I write with someone called Perfect Gentleman. And then I've got 2 series with Berkeley, Courting Justice and Lawless.
That's quite a lot to keep track of.
It is.
And make sure you're actually writing to the right series, because there are tonal differences between the series as well, or are they all the same sort of tone?
No, they do definitely have different tones. One of them is a legal, kind of a legal romance, and that's really heavy on the murder mystery. The one I write, the one I'm really known for is kind of a spy series, and it's a big world. I like to say I use the paranormal world building techniques in a contemporary world, because that's what you want to build a fandom. Yeah. While not just a readership, but a fandom. Like, I want them buying T-shirts and and like be excited about the places you write about.
Now, in terms of new authors, a lot of people listening to this podcast are, like me, writing a first book and working out how to do it. I mean, I sit alongside Mark Dawson, who's, quite an intimidating person to sit next to when you're here, and yourself into the success. What's your advice to people starting out? What should we be focusing on now?
You should be focusing on the books. And this might be, I often say you've got to find the person who's trying to do almost exactly what you're doing, because the journey's different for everyone. In romance, it's very important to have a big backlist. For romance readers, they really want to get in and know that they're going to be able to sink into 5 to 10 books. I don't think that's necessarily the same. You need to know your genre and know what readers do and what readers want. I think in thrillers, they want the big concept. So I think that you want to find that concept, and you want to make it exciting, and you want that hook that brings them in.
Yeah. So really focus on the writing, on the book, which is the good advice I'm getting.
Yeah, it is, and everybody's going to tell you that, and we all want that magic button that we can push, but that magic button, it's kind of, and don't give up on a book that doesn't seem to be selling, because you never know what you could do that could make it popular all of a sudden.
Repackage.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So there's no substitute to putting your bum on a seat and putting your hands on a keyboard.
Pretty much.
Yeah. I feared you were going to say that, because I was really hoping there was a magic button somewhere. But
I know. It would be great.
No, we're getting on with that. Are you optimistic for writing at the moment?
Absolutely. This is the best time in the world to be a writer. You've got all these options. Look, if we were talking 20 years ago, you would have one option. You would be able to go and you would put your proposal in, and they're going to say yes or no. We get to say yes to ourselves now. We get to say yes to what we put out. No, the question is, now we've got to get the readers to say yes to us too, but at least we've got the shot at that in a different way than we had before.
Yeah. And do you know what? I think your genre, romance in particular, has benefited the most from that, because
Absolutely.
There's always been a slight snobbery in the traditional industry about the real throwaway romance reads.
Mm-hmm.
There were a few dedicated ones at Mills and Boon in the UK, for instance, and others who wanted to be on the Booker. They wanted to be the publisher with the Booker list. But actually, people want to read what they want to read, right?
They do.
That's what's happened now, which is amazing.
They do. And I think some books that I think it's also a great time to write books that don't fit neatly into a hole, because you can find an audience for those books now too. You just have to be patient. I think that's the key word. There are 2 words I like to use: patience and discipline. It's what you need to survive, and a thick skin.
Yeah. And your genres are, although romance is the unifying factor, I guess, but actually quite distinctly different. Why is that? Do you enjoy writing in the different areas?
I do.
Or is it a commercial decision?
No, that's not a commercial decision at all. If I was making it, I would just write Masters and Mercenaries. I have to change it up. I write so much that I need to kind of cleanse my palate before, because I love coming up with really great twists, and you can't do that every single day. So I find when I switch genres, I kind of take a break, a little mental break, and I'm ready to come back to the other series when I'm done.
Yeah, that sounds like a healthy way of making sure you're staying fresh
That's right.
and looking after your mind muscle. And tell me about the editing process for you then. Is it different, I guess, for the traditional and the indie?
In a weird, sort of, but I have processes that I always do. I have an editor, weirdly enough, my best friend for 20 years. We basically started out before I was publishing at all, and she would edit my book. She was a teacher, taught English. She still edits. She edits all of my indie stuff, but she reads as I go along. She keeps a Bible so that we know where we're going, and we know that somebody's eye color is this, and no, it's been 5 years, not 3. I do that a lot. We'll do that. Then it'll go, if it's traditional, it'll go to the traditional publisher, to my editor, Kate Seaver at Berkeley. At some point in time, I'm going to read it out loud, every single book.
Or physically read it out loud?
I physically read it out loud. You find things, you can catch stilted dialogue in a way that you can't when you read it. You can sit there and things that your eye will go across when you have to read it, I think you find it. And I think that's really strengthening the books, especially as we go into audio. because that book is going to go into audio someday, and I want to make sure that dialogue sounds realistic. Then we actually have a couple of beta readers who I pay. I have them for very different, specific reasons, because I want to know what's coming to me in the reviews. I don't want to be shocked. Then we have a proofreader, and we're good. So
you have
it's a long editing process.
Yeah, but it sounds very structured. You have a couple of beta readers, you say.
I
You
do.
don't have like a big advance team. 'Cause
I do
think Mark
not.
sends his book out to hundreds.
I do not. You know what? I was told I had this really great mentor. I met Steve Berry when I was kind of mentored by a thriller writer, and his thing was, he told me I needed to take advice from people who are invested in my book, not from readers, not from during that editing process. It needs to be somebody who works with me. So yeah, it's my two editors, like I said, a couple of beta readers I had for 8 years, and it works out really well.
And then it gets launched to your audience,
Yes.
to the readers. You then get some. Do you have a channel for feedback from them, or is it simply the reviews left on?
Yeah, and no, I try not to read them. I don't. You can make that mistake. It depends on if you're the kind of person who can just read a review and look at it logically. I'll go cry somewhere, and one bad review can bring a person like me way down. So I'm better at it now, but I basically have my husband and my assistant read it. If it's coming back consistently one thing, then I know I've got a problem. But if it's this is the worst book ever, which we all get, you kind of know you've made it when you've been
the
told you're the
one-star
worst.
reviews. Yeah. Well, do you know what, Lex? You've had so much success. You've been in bestseller lists. You're making a really good living from your books, and yet it still hurts.
Oh, absolutely.
It's,
That
I mean,
never
that's a
goes away.
human response. And
Yeah, you bleed on the page, and that's you. That's your heart and soul there.
Yeah, you do put it out there when you're
Yeah.
a writer, and any creative industry. And
Yeah.
I used to work in TV news, and you would get criticism. People say that bloke doesn't know what he's talking about
And it
stuff,
hurts.
and the only thing you think about that day was that. Doesn't matter what anyone else has said to you.
It doesn't matter that the other people think it's the greatest thing in the world. So I have learned to kind of try to get that out of my head.
Well, we find your success tremendously inspiring and exciting,
you.
so you can take that from us. And you obviously got a very loyal fan base based on the amount of effort that goes into turning out a really good book each time. So congratulations on your career. It's been really good to catch up. Are you enjoying ThrillerFest?
Absolutely. I love ThrillerFest.
Do you come every year? Or?
I try to get out every couple of years.
Okay.
I find it's very, I like getting the different perspectives, because it's very different from the romance conventions I go to.
Yeah, sure. And are there many other romance writers here who are writing with thriller aspects to them?
There are a couple.
Okay.
There are a couple.
But it's not a huge part of the...
No, it's not. I think we'd be actually better if we got together and combined.
And conversely, if you go to RWA or something like that, do you find there are any romance writers with thriller aspects there?
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Oh no,
okay.
we've got a lot. That's actually, I think, a growing part of romance. Is what we would call romantic suspense is really a romantic thriller, because I think we're finding people like the international aspect, the chasing after something aspect, instead of just woman in danger, which romantic suspense has been for a very long time. So as we see more women writing in heroines in a proactive, she's the heroine, she's going to find something. We see more of the thriller aspect come in rather than just the mystery of who's stalking her.
Yeah. I mean, there's romance in almost every thriller you ever read, actually, isn't there?
Yeah.
I mean, the James Bond romance was fairly one-dimensional, but it was there.
But see, that's where Masters and Mercenaries came from. I grew up loving James Bond, and I wanted James Bond to fall in love and get married and be happy forever.
He did get married once, but his bride was shot.
See, that was terrible.
As he
That
drove
does
away.
not happen in this
No.
one. No. We're going to let her live.
Even I was a little bit upset by that. It was a good opener to the film. Okay, Lexi, thank you so much indeed for joining us. It's been brilliant talking to you.
Thank you.
Well, there's Lexi, and I think it's a particular trait with the romance genre. The volume of books is staggering, isn't it?
Yeah, it's driven by the volume, the appetite of the readers. So if you were choosing a genre and you wanted to maximise your chances of selling a lot of books, romance would be very near the top. It's also very competitive, so it's not easy to get into that genre. But if you can get fans, and they will read a book a day, sometimes maybe more than that. So they're really chewing through books at a ferocious rate. So someone like Lexi with a big catalogue like that, if you hook someone early on, in theory, you've got 60 potential sales that you can make. So it's not, when you think about it that way, it's not hard to see why there are so many of these mega authors who I'll meet next week in Denver, many of them Barbara Free, Thema, E-Force, who are selling millions and millions and millions of books and making a serious amount of money.
Yeah, and I love talking to Lexi about how close she is with her readers as well. And that again is a really great thing in the indie romance area in particular, is how driven these authors are by their relationship with their readers.
Not just romance. I'm
I'm
exactly the same. It's a standard trait, I would say, in successful indie authors, is being excited by the fact that you don't need anybody else to stand in between you on the one hand and your readers on the other. And that's my kind of big equation here, is taking cold traffic, if you want to be kind of internet marketing about it, kind of people who've never heard of you before, and at the end of a process turn them into friends, super fans, and ambassadors. That's definitely something that I see as a common thread through the more successful authors.
You don't need New York between you and the people.
There you go. What more can I add?
That sounded authentic. I'm not sure if they speak like that on the Upper West Side where we are now, but
our New York hosts they're shaking their heads in disgust at the moment.
They've gone down the stairs in shame. Okay, let's hear from Alan Jacobson, who's somebody's done very well over the years. He's had TV series, he's had a film made in the Czech Republic. He is a great promoter. He's a great promoter himself, and there's nothing to be ashamed of in that. In fact, when you're an indie author, it's an essential part of your toolkit. You don't necessarily have to be a gregarious character. You don't have to be an extrovert. But you do need to think about your books as a business, almost to become a little bit objective about it. And if you look at the quotes on Alan's sleeve notes, he's got Nelson DeMille and James Patterson, and I think Lee Child possibly as well. He's got a lot of the big authors all praising his work, and he's gone out and got those, and they're very important. As J.D. Barker said in episode 1 of this, when James Patterson wrote a little quote on his book, what a difference it made to selling it. So let's hear from Alan, who writes FBI stories, and it's an interesting interview, particularly about that crossover with Hollywood. Alan, why don't you start off by giving me the starting price of who Alan is?
So Alan Jacobson is the award-winning USA Today best-selling author of a dozen novels, incorporating the FBI profiler Karen Vail series and the OBSEG Team Black series of novels.
Do you have a background in law enforcement, or?
There's a saying in writing, write what you know, and I believe there's a caveat to that. Because if you write what you know, you're going to have a very limited number of books and stories that you can tell. Maybe 1 or 2 books, and then you're going to be writing the same thing over and over again. So my theory is, if you don't know something, you educate yourself, you learn it, and then you can write what you know in a much more expansive way. So I lucked out back in 1994, January of 1994. I met an FBI agent who was on the short list for promotion to the behavioral analysis unit, the profiling unit. We were in a class on blood spatter pattern analysis.
That sounds like a great class to be in.
It is awesome. It was awesome. I learned so much. My background is that I got a degree in English and then went to chiropractic school.
Oh,
which is a whole other story how I got that, but I never thought that there was a future for me with an English degree, because at the time the guidance I was given is that if you didn't want to teach, there's really nothing that you can do with an English degree. Now looking back, that was odd advice, but it was what it was. And I had my life experience relative to chiropractic. I had horrible classic migraine headaches where I would go virtually blind as a prodrome to the headache. And then when the headache hit, all I could do was sleep. So it impacted me as a young teen. And I went to a chiropractor, and within 3 weeks, never had another migraine headache in my life. So it made a big impact on me, and I decided I wanted to help people the same way I was helped. So got my English degree and then packed it up in New York and moved to California and went to chiropractic school. And practiced for about 8.5, 9 years, injured my wrist, and went back to writing. I mean, that's really a capsule summary. So when I was on the way out of the practice, I took a phone call from the head of the California Department of Justice asking for a reference on one of my employees. So I gave him the reference, and I said, I've got a question for you. I'm writing this novel, and I've got a character who's a criminologist. And I started telling him about the character, and he stops me and he goes, "Your character's not a criminologist, he's a criminalist." I never heard that term. And remember, this is 94, well before CSI and all the other crime drama shows. So it helped me very much knowing that my character was a criminalist. And I said, "Can I call you if I have more questions as I get deeper into the writing?" And he said, "Absolutely." So I did. A few months later, I called him up. I said, "Hey, can I come see the crime lab behind the scenes?" And he said, "No." Defense attorneys could claim that you compromised evidence.
Sure.
But he said, "Instead, let me have you come to this class as an auditing on blood spatter pattern analysis." When I got into that class, I realized, I was told that there was a 4-year waiting list for this class.
He skipped you through.
Well, he skipped me through as, I was auditing.
Yeah.
I wasn't taking the spot. But it was, I felt suddenly very privileged to be in this class with FBI agents and homicide detectives and sheriff's deputies. And that's where I met FBI agent Mark Safrick. And he was the one who, a couple months after that class, was promoted to the profiling unit. And he invited me out, many times, but we spent time at the academy, which at that time the profiling unit was in the basement of the academy, just like at the opening of Silence of the Lambs. That was actually filmed on location there. In later years, they moved it off-site to a town about 15 minutes south of Quantico.
So your books, that is one of the things about writing effectively true crime stories, is the authenticity has to be there, right?
Yes, I insist on it. The research for every one of my books, and I've written, like I said, a dozen, takes about 3 months before I start writing, so I'm outlining and researching at the same time. And then as I start writing, I'm continuing to do research because, your character says something, or you go someplace else with a story and you realize, oh, I don't know about this. I need to know more about XYZ. So then you recontact your contacts or find new ones if it's on a different topic. And, so the research continues all the way to the end product.
And in terms of publishing, how are you published?
Open Road.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you traditional publishing house,
Yes.
and you have an agent, and
I do.
And how did you get all that going in the first place?
So my first agent I got through the Maui Writers Conference, which is now defunct, unfortunately. But they started, I believe they started it, I can't say for sure, something that was enormously beneficial to me, and that was face-to-face meetings with agents and editors. And I came from a business background after having been in practice for 9 years, so I understood that publishing is a business, just like I was when I was practicing. You could be the best chiropractor in the world, but if you don't have any patients, you're not going to keep your doors open. And the same thing, you could be the best writer, but if you don't have any readers, it's not going to count for a whole lot. So I went to this Maui Writers Conference. I purchased what they called 15-minute consultations, face-to-face, and you submitted a manuscript resume, which was a 1-page summary of the book and a 3-sentence pitch. And then all the agents got it, and they checked off interested, not interested, or very interested. And then they gave that packet back to you when you registered, when you arrived at the conference and checked in. So I researched all the agents before I went, so I knew who handled the type of books that I wrote. And I decided not just to meet with the agents who were interested or very interested, but in some cases I wanted to meet with the ones who were not interested. And there were a few of them. I think about 3 or 4 that said no, and 8 or 9 that said yes. So I met with all of them, including the ones that said no, and I got some very interesting, 2 of the 3 said, honestly, I didn't have a chance to read it because I was just too busy. So I
Right.
just checked no. I thought, okay,
Okay,
that's interesting.
honesty.
So I did a pitch on the spot, and the other one said it just wasn't his thing. I said, okay, I can accept that. That's fine. But at least I would know whether it was something that was flawed in the novel or even the summary. And then I bought an additional session with an agent because it was the keynote speaker of the conference, and I was really moved by what she had to say. And she wasn't one of the ones that I had purchased the initial ones. And I got her last appointment on the last day of the conference, and she ultimately became my agent. Wow. She read it, she pulled out a red pen from her purse and started marking it up and just got so excited. She slammed the pen down and she said, wow, I want to see the whole manuscript. Overnight it to me. And within a week, I had a contract for representation.
Wow.
So that's how I got my agent. How I got my first publishing contract with Simon & Schuster was a little circuitous. Right before the Maui Writers Conference, I signed a deal with a small publishing house out of Canada to publish my first novel, False Accusations, the one that the Department of Justice helped me with. And it was probably not a good decision knowing that I was going to this conference, but I really didn't know what to expect from the conference. I didn't know if anything would come of it. And I had an offer to publish, so I went ahead with it. Turns out that they were going bankrupt just when my book was due to launch. I was able to get, I don't remember how many copies, hundreds of copies before they closed down. The printer was, it was not the same, it was a third-party printer, so I found out who the printer was. I called them directly, I got the book shipped to me. I carried the boxes into the stores, the bookstores where I had signings set up, and sold it on consignment, which felt a little odd at the time. This was, 97, but it sold really well. And the bookstore said, how can we get more copies? Well, they couldn't at that time, but I had an agent then, and she turned around and sold it to Pocketbooks.
So you got the rights back from the defunct
Yes,
publisher.
that was a whole other story. I had to
Yeah.
hire an attorney to get the rights back.
Can be a problem, yeah.
Yeah, because they were bankrupt, so
Okay.
there was nobody representing
Yeah. So she then sold it into Simon & Schuster.
Two-book deal, yeah.
And you've had a TV development. I mean, most people say, there's an option, I'm going to have a meeting and blah, blah, blah. But you've actually seen the final product.
Well, yes and no. So let me qualify that. We had a TV movie made in the Czech Republic by one of their very well-known screenwriters, and I'm going to butcher the name, but Jiří Hubák. Okay. And I'm sure I got that wrong. But he was it was a god in the Czech Republic. And he wrote the screenplay, and it came out, and it did very well. So they contacted us a few years later and wanted to re-up for another series of showings. So that was very cool, seeing they sent us a DVD, and it was very fun watching the scenes. I couldn't understand it. It wasn't subtitled in English, but I knew obviously all the scenes. And fast forward to 2 years ago, my wife and I were in the Czech Republic. We took a tour guide to another area of Prague, outside Prague, and we got on the topic of writing and what I did, and I told her about it, and I said, in fact, we had a movie produced in the Czech Republic, and she said, oh, really? What's the name of it? I said, False Accusations, and I said, in fact, you may know the screenwriter. I was told he was well known in the Czech Republic. I mentioned his name, and she almost drove off the road.
Right.
He was, even bigger than I had known. And so that was very exciting. Relative to the United States, so we had, about 6 years ago, my agent got an offer for both a feature film and a 2-hour TV movie for the first book in the Karen Vail series, which was The Seventh Victim. She's the FBI profiler that I ended up writing about. And my agent said, which one do you want to take, feature film or TV movie? And I went, how do I make that decision? And he said, well, let me help you. A TV show TV movie will be out within 6 months, 99.9% chance. A feature film, 5 years from now, we could be sitting here saying, why haven't they gone before the cameras? What's going on? And if a new executive comes in and takes over the helm, he'll more than likely say, okay, I only want my, the properties we acquire while I'm in charge. So he says you could end up with nothing, and then we won't get the rights back, and we're kind of in trouble. So I said, all right, let's take the TV movie if you can get me a production credit. So he said, oh, that's like impossible, but I'll see what I can do. Well, TNT loved the Karen Vail series so much, they agreed to that. So I was co-producing.
What did that actually involve beyond being on IMDb?
Meeting with the executive producer and producer, discussing the vision, discussing where it would be filmed, because we had discounts, tax credits in North Carolina, which in the winter can look very much like Virginia. So, and then casting less of a input. It was more. That's
more of a specialist thing, I guess.
Yeah, and it's more studio who they have deals with. Even the producers don't have really much any say. I mean, you can have say, but they're not going to listen to you. So everything was moving along beautifully. They commissioned a screenplay from a well-known screenwriter, and she did a fabulous job. I was blown away because I'd seen a screenplay from a different writer for a feature film because we had optioned it previously along with one of my OPSEC Team Black novels. And that one was disappointing. It didn't follow the source material, the novel, very closely. This one did. And it's very, very difficult to get a 400-page novel into a 2-hour screenplay, and she did just a masterful job. And so everything was moving along quite nicely. And unfortunately, the TNT Mystery Movie Night was going to be 12 best-selling novels adapted to screen. They filmed the first 6. Scott Turo's was the first, was the sequel to Presumed Innocent. I think Lisa Gardner had one in there. Anyway, the ratings were horrible, and the sponsors pulled out. There went our $4 million budget, and we were canceled. We were project number 7.
You were the Apollo 19 of
We were, exactly.
Cancelled for budget funding reasons.
Exactly.
Okay.
The astronauts that were going to fly Apollo 19 and 18 and 20.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good analogy.
So, okay, and what happens with the rights now? Do they sit there with the TNT, or do you get them back?
We were very, very, very fortunate to get the rights back.
You got them back, so you could potentially sell them again. Because what you really want is a series. I mean, viewers eat up CSI week in, week out.
Yes.
It's a genre that works, right?
That was the plan, to either, because they optioned the entire Vail series, the plan was to do either 4 2-hour movies and see how it goes if they want to do a series, or just do the 2-hour movie and then move right into a TV series from there, where each book would be a season. So, it was a great plan, but, man plans and God laughs, right?
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Okay, now my last area to ask you about is about coming to conferences.
Yes.
Why are you doing? Is it worth it for a writer?
All conferences are a little different. ThrillerFest, there are a lot of aspiring writers, a lot of authors, published authors, some fans. BoucherCon, I think, tends to be more fan-oriented in terms of the audience. So you get a little different approach depending upon the type of conference you go to. ThrillerFest, I've been to every one. This is my 13th. It's really evolved and matured. It is the premier conference for thriller writers and readers. Those who choose to come and learn. If you're an aspiring writer, you get to learn from the masters, the ones who've been doing it a really long time and who have honed their skill. I mean, in any profession, you do something for 1 year, you may think you're really good at it, but the fact is, 10 years from then, you're going to look back and go, man, I'm so much better now. And 20 years from then, you're going to go, wow, I am really at the top of my game. So, I've been doing this 20 years. I really feel like I'm at the top of my game. But you still learn from others, colleagues that you talk with, and how they do things and how they approach things. And then you've got the marketing aspect and the publishing aspect, can all commiserate and talk about issues we've had. It's a great collegial environment.
Useful for that. And the whole indie world's exploding at the moment. You're not tempted to go off in that direction? New series, maybe?
I would never say never. It's really interesting. I know some friends who have done it and done extraordinarily well. But it's true in anything. I mean, you have authors that go the traditional route and do extraordinarily well, and others that just flame out. So you never quite know. The indie route is a little more difficult, obviously, because you're the captain of the ship, and you have to steer it. You have to do the publicity, the marketing. Everything that happens relative to that book is on your desk. So it's not that as a traditionally published author, you're not involved. I mean, obviously, authors today versus when I first started 20 years ago, it's very different. We are very much involved in every aspect of it. But as an indie author, you can't have a bad day. It's on your plate. It's all your responsibility.
Well, Alan, thank you for joining us. We're going to wish you and Karen future success. So Karen keeps locking up the bad guys and serves you well. We'll look out for her as well, and we'll keep an eye on the TV channels, because who knows, now you have the rights back.
Great.
Karen Vail could make an
Still
appearance.
working it.
Yeah. There's Alan Jacobson. He even was, I don't know if you noticed in the interview, if you're watching on YouTube, he was wearing a polo shirt that had the Karen Weir, is that his character's name? I can't remember. Karen Vail stories on his polo shirt. But there's somebody who knows this is his business and nobody else is going to go out for him when you're an indie.
Yeah, no, I think he was interesting. I didn't know who he was, and I don't think he knew who I was. But he saw us with our cameras set up, interviewing people, and came up to me, and the first thing he said to me was, "Can I be on your show?"
Yeah, and I say indie. I think he's trad actually, but that's irrelevant for him promoting himself. He's promoting himself.
I would not. I'm not wired that way. I'm not that comfortable going to people I don't know. I'm not good at small talk usually. John, on the other hand, has been fantastic at small talk.
He'll go up to anyone and talk to them.
He will. He's a slut, basically. Let's be honest.
He's no shame.
He's no shame at all. But yeah, Alan was very abrupt, and not abrupt. He was very forthright, knows what he wanted, and realised there was a good chance to get his name out there, and went for it. So kudos. I have no problem with that at all.
Now, our next interviewee is a man called David Morrell. David wrote his first novel in 1972. It was adapted into a film with Sylvester Stallone 10 years later in 1982. You may remember it was called Rambo. And his story behind the first book is really interesting. And I wasn't sure, I didn't know a lot about David Morrell, knew who he was. But the interview really revealed to me this is a deep thinker about writing. In fact, ironically, because Rambo's portrayed as this rather shallow bloodfest, but
only in the film.
Only in the film.
The book is excellent. The book is much better than the film.
But even in the film, he talks about the violence, and we worked for an organisation that spent a lot of time thinking about violence in films, and his name and his book, his films came up in our historical records when we were discussing things, and I mentioned that to him. So he's a really interesting guy to talk to, and I can tell you now, as a result of this brief chat, we've arranged to have David Morrell on for a full 40-minute interview in the autumn, because he's the guy who will talk to you directly about why you're writing as being one of the most important things you need to answer to be a successful writer. But that's what we got onto in the last 30 seconds of this interview. A great guy to talk to. So let's hear from David Morrell. David, how lovely of you to come and talk to us on the SPF podcast.
I'm glad to be here.
Well, we're very excited. I assume Rambo was your First Blood, I think it was the novel, was your first book. And I'm right in saying that you wrote it in the 70s?
Yes. No, First Blood was, in fact, it's fun to say First Blood was my first novel, right? So, but you can say the debut novel, but it was my first, and I started it, seems so long ago, in 1968. What people in the UK wouldn't know, perhaps, and some people in the United States don't remember, is that 1968 was the year of riots in the United States because of the assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. The Vietnam War, there weren't 10 riots or 50 riots or 100 riots, there were several hundred riots. And some cities in the United States never recovered, such as inner Detroit, the buildings were never reclaimed. And I got to thinking that it was as if the Vietnam War had come home. And then, you have those moments as an author where you say, what if someone, a decorated soldier from Vietnam, came back disaffected by the war, hating himself for what he'd learned about himself in the war, and was wandering the country to try to come to terms with what had happened to him, grew his beard, grew long hair, about sort of what was then called hippies, and police at that time did not like people with long hair and beards. So they would naturally go after him. It was just a fact of life in those days. So here we have the greatest gunfighter in the West, who's trying to hang up his guns, and they won't let him. I saw First Blood as a Western, and in effect, the Vietnam War is fought in America. That was the idea of writing the book. I started it in 1968 because of the riots, and I was in graduate school at the time, so it took me a while, but it took me 3 years, and the summer of '71 I finally finished.
Right, it's difficult to think now because it's been so copied, and the themes that you talk about have been done in very many quite well-known pieces. It's difficult to imagine quite how original that was in 1968.
There were a lot of original parts of it. One was that outside the pulp universe of cheap paperbacks, there had not been a novel that had that much action in it. It is basically one long chase, and that's why the movies liked it so much, because they could take it. Was the film adaptation First Blood is about 96 minutes, and 55 minutes of it are action. Very unusual. So that was a new way of thinking about the amount of action in a book. And the other was that, as I said, I was in graduate school and I was studying Hemingway. I don't write like Hemingway, but Hemingway had a theory about writing about things as if they'd never been written about before. And I was looking at the way he wrote action in For Whom the Bell Tolls and A Farewell to Arms and the gunfights in To Heaven Have Not, a gangster novel. And I thought, it's like he invented it for the first time. So when I was writing the action scenes in First Blood, I was trying to find language that hadn't been used before. And my academic background, naturally, that's the way I would think. So there were two elements there that hadn't been done before.
The film adaptation, early 80s, probably 10 years on from the publication?
10 years later, you've got a good memory. The film occurred in 1982, and there's a whole adventure there, too. I sold the film rights to Columbia Pictures before the novel was published 10 years earlier. At that time, Richard Brooks was going to write and direct. A year later, Columbia, I don't know what happened, Columbia sold it to Warner Brothers. And there was talk of Martin Ritt, the director. He'd done a Southern picture called Sounder, and the novel First Blood is set sort of in the south of the United States. And there was talk about Paul Newman being in it, but playing the police chief, with maybe Robert Blake playing Rambo. And then that morphed into Sidney Pollack, one of my favorite directors, with Steve McQueen as Rambo because of the motorcycle. And Sidney told me that they were ready to shoot when they realized that Steve McQueen was about 45 years old, and there were, in 1975, by this time, no 45-year-old Vietnam veterans. So there were, all told, about 4 studios and 26 scripts before finally the people who made the film, Carolco Pictures, with Andrew Vanya and Mario Casar as producers, before they got the idea, and they hired Sylvester, who had been in Rocky, but had never, Sylvester Stallone, but had never been in a hit movie of that proportion. He'd been in a lot of successful movies, but not anything big like Rocky. So they thought we'll try it, and he'll do well in the overseas.
So Rocky predated Rambo.
Yes,
okay,
that's right.
I wondered if it was his first, is it like his breakout? But he was really, I mean, Rocky today is a.
Sylvester had done Fist, and he'd done the titles aren't coming to me at the moment, but he'd done some other films that were successful, Nighthawks, but how these things happen. And Sylvester later said that he thought that First Blood was his most important film because it established him in something other than Rocky.
Yeah. It was a controversial film. I mean, I don't know what it was like in the States, but in the UK, in fact, funny enough, you might not know, John and I used to work together as film examiners in the UK, giving certificates out.
Really? Film examiners?
Long after Rambo, but we were dealing with, you look at the historical case notes, and Rambo is a film that comes up. It was very controversial in its day. Newspapers in the UK took against it for its level of violence. What's interesting to me is you alluded to that as being a deliberate decision at the beginning, that there would be non-stop action to give it a particular tone. There wasn't an accident of the film.
Well, let's back up, though. This business about the film examiner, I know the film has a reputation for but it isn't in the film. We have the fight where he escapes from the jail, which basically is pretty, it's a fight in a jail, and he comes out and he gets on the motorcycle and he races away, and we have the car chase. But this is pretty, it's very, Ted Kotcheff did a hell of a job directing it, but if you look at it carefully, a man falls out of a helicopter and some nameless deputies are in a car crash, and that's the extent of the violence. But there's a lot of property damage. And in this country, in those days, the Siskel and Ebert were two very popular American film critics. And Siskel and Ebert at the movies, and they had the thumbs up and the thumbs down reviews. And I remember them being kind of shocked by the film because of the property damage. And in this country, we have the Chamber of Commerce, which is about, local businesses and all. And it was like they were the critics for the Chamber of Commerce because property was damaged, but there really aren't many people hurt. And so I never understood, this thing about the violence. It is an action picture, and might add that over the years, as CGI has added more and more to movies, making them so unrealistic and more literally like cartoons, that the stunts, which are not CGI, the stunts in First Blood, with real people doing real things, and sometimes Sylvester Stallone doing his own stunts, and he was injured many times in the movie making of it, that the movie feels realistic now. That people there's nothing in there that a human being could not physically do, as opposed to what we see now in movies.
What impact did the film have on your writing career?
Well, it was my first novel. The hardest thing for a novelist is to come out of the chute, so to speak, at the beginning and get attention. And First Blood, which was published in '72, as the crisis in the country, in the United States, about the Vietnam War, and it was pretty clear that was not going to end well. It took a while, but it was pretty clear this was not what the people who started had hoped for. So the novel came out at the right time. And then in terms of getting attention, and for a first novel, it was reviewed everywhere. I could go on with titles that might not be recognizable in the UK, but it was reviewed everywhere. It was so unusual for a first novel. So basically it established me. I was so lucky, and I was young. I think I was 29. And I was so young and so lucky, although I'd worked like crazy to do the book, 3 years. And that set me up so that later novels, people would say, oh, he's the guy that did First Blood. So first novel really did literally establish my career.
I'm not going to ask exactly how old you are today, but
I will tell you, I'm 75.
75, and you handed us a little card with your latest novel as you arrive, which is, so tell us about that.
Well, the key to being a novelist is to have, for me at least, a long career, and to look ahead and grow. So I had, in various decades, written different kinds of books. In the 70s, with First Blood, I was writing what might be called outdoor action. In the 80s, I wrote a series of very influential espionage novels, the Brotherhood of the Rose, the Fraternity of the Stone, and the League of Night and Fog. In fact, I don't know if anybody in the UK watches the Super Bowl, but it is a big deal here. And the Brotherhood of the Rose was adapted into the only miniseries to air after a Super Bowl. I mean, it did really well. And it was an attempt to merge the best of the UK spy novel, as typified by John le Carré, with authentic spy details, and the American spy novel, which had lousy spy details but had lots of action. So to try to marry those, and that's what they did. And in various decades, always with suspense and action, but different kinds of genres. Well, in this decade, I became absolutely fascinated with the Victorian era in England, and I'm Canadian. I have American citizenship, but I was raised in Canada, so I'm in the Commonwealth, so I'm sort of UK.
You're subjects along with us of the Queen.
Go. And I just thought, it's like, and my father was a British airman who was killed on D-Day, and I thought, I've always wanted to do this, so I spent several years reading nothing but books about Victorian literature with the help of a Victorian historian, I love the rhyme, of Judith Flanders, and another UK scholar named Greville Lindop, who was from the University of Manchester. And I wrote 3 books about Thomas de Quincey, who was the author of Confessions of an English Opium Eater, and who invented the word subconscious, the concept subconscious, and whom Freud may have lifted from. And de Quincey was fascinated by mass murder. So I thought, this is cool. I've got myself an opium addict who's interested in mass murder and invented the word subconscious. So I wrote 3 novels about him and about his daughter, who was a real-life person named Emily de Quincey, who sort of was his Watson. And the books, it sounds funny for this Canadian American talking to the UK about these books, but I believe that I have details in these books that people raised in the UK have no idea of. I was looking for those items in the Victorian mode that would be news, such as, how much did a middle class or upper class woman's clothes weigh in 1854?
A lot.
37 pounds. And the reason for that is, and again, this is the kind of books they are, in 1851 in Hyde Park, the Crystal Palace exhibit occurred, which is the first World's Fair. And the trend for women's dresses to have hoops, which were made either of whale's teeth or of metal hoops, they had to be covered. And that took 12 yards of ruffled satin, and then it took lead weights in the dresses so they wouldn't pop up. And by the time you're done with all the stuff, it was 37 pounds, as measured by a historian. And so that's the kind of things that I just delighted in having, that I could. Now, Dickens never mentioned this stuff because he took it for granted. So my goal was to write historic Victorian thrillers that were absolutely authentic and would have the kinds of real-life details that nobody at the time was talking about in fiction, but that I could put in, like graves. How do they dig graves? Well, they did the graves because there wasn't enough room, so the coffins were put vertically. So you'd bring the coffin to the graveyard, and then everybody would be told to get out, and then what they do is they dig down and they jump up and down on the coffins below and crunch everything down, and then they'd put the coffin in, and a year later they'd be back crushing that one down.
This is amazing, and
this is cool.
You're selling the book brilliantly. A long way from Rambo, though.
It is, and just to be clear, the book's called Murder is a Fine Art, and Inspector of the Dead, and Ruler of the Night. Okay. Blatant. This is what happens when you come to America.
You do.
You start hard selling, So anyway, you were saying about how it went. Well, as I said, it's. What I'm about is trying to grow, trying to move forward, trying to learn. And I was a professor. I have a PhD in American literature, a Canadian with a I don't know. And so my goal is to keep learning and to try to take that learning and to put it in books. And I'd written other historical novels, but for this, for these 3 Victorian books, it was just, I cannot tell you the heaven I was in. I sometimes thought I was on the drugs that De Quincey was on. I thought I was there. And I had this 1851 map that had been released during the Crystal Palace for tourists. And I could get around on that sucker as if I was there. It was just wonderful. So it's a journey, right? Here we have Rambo and First Blood, and all the way over here.
It's a personal journey for you of development, and I can see that's important to you to keep developing. But do you think you write for the same reasons? Because the way you described First Blood, it was almost a political novel. You were thinking a lot about the realities of the Vietnam War.
Yes.
And do you think I don't want to dwell on this at all, but you mentioned your father died on Dido. We thank him for his service. We lived on the edge of that at the time. But do you think that impact on your family was the reason perhaps you were questioning war?
I had a terrible upbringing. I mean, my mother struggled, and I was put in an orphanage and all of that. If we have the time, he was a naval airman, and his job was to fly over where the shells were landing and report where they were landing to tell the ships how to adjust their trajectory, how far we have come. And he was shot down doing this. And in fact, much later in life, I became a pilot, and I never understood the drive until I thought maybe I'm being reincarnated, or something. Now, the trick with First Blood was to write a political novel that didn't feel like a political novel. So we have the police chief, and none of this is in the movie. We have a police chief who is old enough to be Rambo's father, who fought in Korea, an American war, they don't call it a war, and who was in basically conventional military maneuvers. And now we have Rambo, young enough to be his son, who fought in Vietnam, a whole different war, a guerrilla war. And if we think of the police chief as being sort of right-wing and conservative, and we think of Rambo as coming back disaffected by the war, like furious about the war. None of this is, in the movie he's a victim, but in the novel he's angry. And to have these two sides going, and in the novel I alternated viewpoints. So we had the policeman looking at Rambo, the Rambo looking at the policeman, and back and forth, so you never knew who to cheer for. And depending on your political point of view, you'd say, well, he's right or he's right. But then you'd say, well, I sort of get this idea over here. So it went back and forth until the climax you didn't know who to cheer for. And I didn't explain any of that, So, and the man who trained Rambo, Colonel Sam Troutman, is Uncle Sam. It's an allegory. He's the system. So the whole idea in the novel was the system that created Rambo destroys him. But you can read it as a straight adventure novel and not see any of that. But if you're in the know, then you know what I'm saying. And I don't think I mentioned Vietnam, but maybe 3 times in the whole book. And maybe that's why the book it's never been out of print. There's an active edition in the UK that's still, been released at 46 years, never been out of print. It's cool.
I bet it still sounds fresh, reads fresh. And that's a brilliant way of writing, because the people who decide that they're going to ram it down your throat and explain,
it doesn't work.
Of course it doesn't work. But to have a novel that you take...
It works subliminally. It's that De Quincey thing again,
Well, look, we're really running out of time. It's been brilliant talking to you, David.
I just love talking about this stuff, and just the same thing in my Victorian books and Murder is a Fine Art, etc. These are all latent political books about the 1% who owned England at the time and how they controlled, so that you had the books are about people in the lower class who worked themselves up higher in order to commit mayhem against the people they've always hated, but they can't do it until they get high enough to have the power to do it. And I've not yet had any reviewer who understands that this is a really, really it's almost a revolutionary series of novels.
Fantastic. You've written it too subtly. I'm joking, of course.
No.
It's exactly what you should be doing. And I think the best thing that we can take is somebody. I'm writing my first novel. Mark, who's the co-presenter, is a very established and well-regarded novel writer, thriller writer.
Terrific.
But what we both take is you're in your 70s and you want to improve and you want to develop yourself and you want to get better.
Keep going, So, I mean, I swim 35 minutes a day, half a mile, laps, and, I'm still going. Someone once said that if you took my books in chronological order, they would be the autobiography of my soul, and that they would show as I moved along what I was interested in and the ideas that mattered to me.
That's great. That's what writing should be. We should be seeing you the author develop as well, I think.
That's my hope. That's what I tried to do. And some book, when I start a novel, I always write a letter to myself. And the question is, why is this work worth a year of your life? And so there has to be something in it that when I come out the other side, I'm different. Now, I wrote one novel so I could learn how to fly. Sometimes it's the research, and other times it's, the history of honestly, I thought I was there. I thought I was in it's like a Jack Finney or a Richard Matheson novel where I'd been sucked back into that time. It was hypnotic. Anyway, we won't go there.
We'll see you at the ball tonight.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, David. There's David Morrell. The Rambo films, I suppose, his argument was the reputation they have isn't deserved because actually the violence is more sparing.
The first one is a very good film, right? Yeah. It's been coloured by the slightly ridiculous films that followed. I remember when we were working together, we saw Rambo 4, I think it was, where he basically takes out a battalion of...
It was brilliant.
It's an interesting film, but the first one I really like. It's very low key, low budget. It's more of a character study of PTSD. It wouldn't have been called that in those days. And the book is a character study of Rambo. It's also is quite desperate. The things that happen. The ending is completely different. So I really enjoyed the book, and he's a lovely, gregarious guy. His Facebook page is actually worth following. He refers to himself as Rambo's father so he knows Rambo is his meal ticket. He's been writing, but I don't think he ever achieved the huge levels of success again, which is fine because not many people will ever get to that kind of level anyway. So,
but he's enjoying his writing now about Victorian England and
exactly. He's got a really varied background. He taught English as a professor, I think, as well at one point. So, really great writer with a lot that we can all learn from.
Yeah, and I was trying to work out, because he started writing Rambo in 1968, he said that if he wasn't the first, he was one of the very first people who started to change the political narrative of Vietnam. So it went from being a war where you were supposed to be supporting your forces, and as we do, we do pay tribute to the armed forces, but actually it was a war that was deeply controversial for class reasons, for race reasons in the US as well. And he was one of those authors who started to write that story about these guys coming back and the fractured nature of the society around the war. And of course it spawned a whole plethora of films and books.
Yeah, things like Platoon and he's
Apocalypse Now and
Full Metal Jacket. You go on and on about that, but he would be one of the first to really look into the personal effects of a conflict like that. So if you think Rambo is Sylvester Stallone, a bulked up Sylvester Stallone gurning for the camera. I like Sylvester Stallone, but anyway, it isn't like that. If you haven't read the book, I would recommend you take a look at it, because it's a really excellent book.
Yeah, okay.
Really bad ebook though. I read it on ebook and it's been terribly formatted, really badly published.
Well, that was the one thing, and I should mention this, that Karen Slaughter said something in her interview when we talked about indies. She said, well, you need to get your book edited. And the implication being she thought that a lot of indies don't use editors. And David Morrell was very kind of, independent publishing's dying after we spoke to him. And I can understand your mind in traditional publishing. It's working brilliantly well for you, or has worked well for you. And you always feel things are going to change dramatically. It might not necessarily benefit you, so there might be, even if it's subconscious, a feeling of slight threat from it. But we kind of brush that off a little bit, don't we? They don't have to think about it or know the details of it.
No. In both cases, I think. Well, so I don't really remember what Cameron said, but the David, that's not right. I mean, we can certainly say it isn't declining at all. It's in fact it's quite the other. It's quite the opposite. So that's fine. David is fair to say of the older generation, and as you say, may not have any reason to investigate indie in any kind of depth, but.
Well, he's 75 and he's writing books. He could make more money, I think, if he sold them independent. He's got a good name.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think it's...
No, it's not on his radar, so that's fair enough. No problem with that at all.
Okay, look, our final interview is with a guy called Jim Grant. He's actually British, born in Coventry, now lives in the United States. He writes under the pen name Lee Child. He has a character called Jack Reacher, I believe.
Never heard of him.
You've never heard of him. Jack Reacher, whose name comes from the fact that...
Lee Child is very, very tall. As you look at the video, you'll see much shorter than James, and obviously I'm shorter than James, so there's a picture of the three of us where I'm come down to about his nipples. But he is, he got the name for Reacher from going to stores with his wife, and he said he was always asked by little old ladies if he could help them get cans down from the top shelf. Or whatever it was, top shelf, maybe it was something else. But anyway, his wife said, "You'd make a great Reacher," and that was the moment where he realised that Reacher was a pretty good name, and it is. I mean, obviously that he's not just the name of the character that's made that so successful. He writes fantastic books, and everyone told me before we came here that he was funny and cool, and he's more funny. He's funnier and a lot cooler than I thought. He's just a really smart guy. And the kind of guy you'd love to sit down and have a beer with.
Okay, well, let's hear from Lee Child. My first question is, why do you write?
Why? Because, I mean, the quick answer to that is to make a living. We've got to work. The sort of broader answer is I love entertaining people. I just love that idea that something I can do will give people pleasure for however long it lasts. I used to work in television and I loved that idea, and I just don't particularly care about the medium. Books I love books, but it's entertainment for me. As long as somebody's enjoying what I'm doing, then I'm happy.
That's the motivation. That's the kick you get out of it, is knowing that happens.
Yeah.
You get good feedback from your readers. You're so well known now. Do you get regular contact from readers?
Yeah. I started out when people still wrote letters, and I would get, fan mail occasionally, and then email came along and it exploded. And so now we get, 10 or 20,000 a week. And the feedback is never quite in time, because books, there's a delay. You write a book and then a certain amount of delay before it comes out, and then a delay again before people have read it. So by the time you get specific feedback, you're already possibly one or two books further on. So it's hard to incorporate feedback, but I love to get it, simply to see. It really emphasizes one very central truth, I think, which is that the reader creates the book just as much as the writer does. And therefore, if you've got 1 million readers, essentially you've got 1 million different books, and they're all reacting slightly differently. So in a way, I'm really, really happy to get the feedback, but there's not much you can do with it because it's just one voice amongst many.
Yeah, I suppose that's the thing about art. Art is completed by the viewer.
It definitely is, especially in the case of books. I mean, it's extremely pointed that you make these strange black marks on white paper, and then months or even years later, somebody else uses those to reconstruct the scene in their own head. And at that point, it's their mental energy that's being spent, not mine. It's their calories that are being burned, not mine. So definitely, they are creating the story.
You are a superstar in the thriller genre now, and it's difficult to have a conversation about thriller writing without somebody referencing you now. Is writing a book today, does it feel different to you than writing it before you were so well known?
It does in a way, because, as I said, I was looking to make a living, and so it was a kind of financial contract at the very beginning. Now it's an emotional contract between me and the reader. They want to have another Reacher book next year, and I would hate to let them down. And so I do it as well as I can and hope they like it.
But that's not the sole reason you do it for. Do you still enjoy the writing process, or is there an added pressure now that doesn't make it quite as enjoyable for you?
There's an added pressure, definitely, because of so many people's expectations. But you can dodge that, really, and write for yourself. That's really the only way to do it. And so the actual writing process, I love it. It's a joy just to sit down and mechanically, if there's a great sentence, you feel proud of it. I love the process. The rest of it, the promotion and the traveling and all of that kind of thing, in itself, that's horrible because it's such a bore now traveling. But when you get to meet the readers, that's great. So it's worth it.
Yeah, and you talk a lot. You've spoken about your process in the past. I think you still do this thing where you start on the day of your redundancy from Granada. So
1st of September I start every year. Partly because you've got to have some structure in your year. You know, if you put it off until you felt like it, you would probably never do it.
My final question is: there's a growing number of independent authors now. Do you have a view on the sort of movement and the changes that are taking place in publishing?
I was very excited about the self-publishing thing. You know, it's a bit over 10 years now that it's been around. I thought it was a tremendous coup, really, a really democratizing stroke, really unique in artistic history, if you think about it. Suddenly, something was available to everybody, where before it had been highly selective. So it was quite inspiring, but I'm kind of disappointed afterward because not much has happened. You know, we haven't seen anybody really exploit the new freedoms. We haven't seen anybody change it up into a new form. And technically speaking, the online discovery is incredibly hard, so that people are writing books without any real prospect of getting them in front of the public, except, yeah, sure, they're available online, but how do you promote them? How do you bring them to people's attention? After 10 years, we really haven't solved that problem yet.
Yeah. Okay, well, it's really interesting to hear, and I really appreciate the fact you've taken some time to chat to us on our little podcast, Lee, so thank you so much. So it was one of our first interviews, actually. John and I came to register at ThrillerFest the night before. It was quiet, there weren't many people there, and I think we were about the first to register. And as we were just walking out of the hotel, this tall guy walked out towards the smoking area outside, and we thought...
With Heather Graham.
With Heather Graham, not that Heather Graham.
No.
We thought, that's Lee Child, and we stalked him and got a photograph with him and set up the podcast interview, which he immediately said yes to. I mean, the only slight downside is that as we were talking to him, I could see he was backing away because he had a panel to go to at that time.
He had a one-on-one. He was interviewing Meg Cabot, I think it was. He was basically the MC for that, so he had a definite deadline.
Well, we had a chat with him and got to hear a bit. I tried to ask him original-ish questions that I could think of that I think we would, aspiring authors, would like to hear from. One of the interesting ones for me is, what's it like writing when you're a superstar? Do things change? And he answered that very well. And he was very honest about writing for money as well in the early days. And then his answer on independent publishing, which might cause a little bit of controversy here and there. I mean, he started off... He's a little bit of a shop steward, I think, for Granada TV in the UK, and he saw indie publishing as a revolution, as a movement, a democratizing movement, is how he described it. But he said he's been a bit disappointed with what's happened since. And what's your take on that?
Disappointed with is that it hasn't innovated, or he doesn't. I think he's expecting something more technologically interesting, which arguably hasn't happened. I mean, there are great versions of George R.R. Martin was here at ThrillerFest, and there are some fantastic enhanced versions of the Game of Thrones books on the Apple Store, and that's the exception rather than the rule. So I think he may have been expecting that, but it is democratizing. Perhaps he doesn't know just how democratizing it is. But he certainly wasn't. I was worried that he might be more dismissive of indie publishing, because I've heard that might be his view before. I don't think that is his view. I think he realizes that it's an open, it's a big opening for people to get their stories out. Perhaps his gripe is with the platforms themselves. That Amazon maybe he thinks they haven't pushed the boundaries far enough yet. But this is coming. Things are changing all the time. Kindle in Motion is a new thing that he's going to be getting into. We'll be finding out about soon.
Well, the bottom line here is that he's a supporter of writers, and that's what he's doing. And he doesn't need to be at ThrillerFest, right?
No.
But he's there, and he's chairing, and he's active, and he was at a board meeting when we first arrived. He wants people to be successful writers, and I suppose ultimately he and we don't really care how books get out there.
No, and also, I think it's pretty obvious that he likes being around writers, and writers tend to be like that. When I started writing traditionally in 99, 2000, I felt that way too. That was the thing I loved about it most of all, was to be able to hang out with writers. I met Zadie Smith before she was famous at a drinks party, before she was published. And it is exciting to be invited into what at least seemed to me to be this kind of almost like a secret forbidden world. So that's changed a bit, and he doesn't need to do that, like you say. But writers have the same kinds of concerns and worries, whether you're selling a zillion books like he is, or if you're selling a couple of million like me, or people selling handfuls. We're all similar. We all have the same kinds of issues and foibles, just the same as everybody else.
Okay. Look, it's been really a treat for us to rub shoulders with some of the greats in writing. This week in ThrillerFest in New York. Next week, Romance Writers of America for Mark. So you'll be doing the same sort of thing there in a different genre. And we're back in the States in September. So if you didn't get a chance to come to New York and get a beer off us, which we'll show some pictures for the YouTube version of somebody arrived late and drunk.
We all did. Anyway, yes, I was. A little bit. And
they got pins. But you can join us. We'll have another drink session down in St. Petersburg or St. Pete Beach in September. But this is we have to say goodbye to Manhattan. This is the Upper West Side, which sounds very cool, and it is very cool. We've got to say thank you again to Cameron and his girlfriend Melanie, who've hosted us today, given us a lovely brunch, allowed us to watch the World Cup, and then rather rudely we've taken over their house as a podcast TV set or video set, whatever you want to call it. And John, get in here, get in on the shot and say goodbye, because John's been there. He's the third member of the team. Oh, you stepped on the cable.
Well, look,
Say goodbye, John.
And it all went.
You shouldn't do that.
Come on, stand here. John is. Oh, you stepped on the cable again. He's the third member of the team. Yeah. He's the reason that we got a lot of those superstars to come and talk to us. And so thank you, John. You had a good week?
It's been above average.
Good.
Let me get out a shot.
Yeah, with that, we're going to say goodbye. We'll be back to normal in the UK next week. Thank you very much for enjoying. I hope you've enjoyed these episodes from New York, and have a great next 7 days writing and a great next 7 days marketing and selling your books. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Self-Publishing Formula podcast. Visit us at selfpublishingformula.com for more information, show notes, and links on today's topics. You can also sign up for our free video series on using Facebook ads to grow your mailing list. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider leaving us a review on iTunes. We'll see you next time.